The weights hit the floor with a metallic crash that echoed through the gym, followed immediately by cruel laughter. Sarah Martinez didn't look up from her rowing machine, but every muscle in her body tensed as she recognized the sound. In her 8 years as a Navy SEAL, she had learned to identify danger through all 5 senses, and right now, every instinct was telling her that someone was about to get hurt. She continued her steady rowing rhythm, 90 strokes per minute, exactly the pace that had gotten her through Hell Week all those years ago. Through the mirror mounted on the wall in front of her, she watched the scene unfolding near the free weight section. 3 men, all wearing matching black tank tops and sporting the kind of overly muscled physiques that screamed steroid abuse, had surrounded Miguel Santos, the gym's evening janitor. Miguel was 63 years old, barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, and had been working at Iron Valley Fitness for nearly a decade. Sarah knew this because she made it her business to know the people around her, another habit left over from her military days. She also knew that Miguel sent most of his paycheck back to his family in El Salvador, that he was studying English at the community college on weekends, and that he always smiled and said good morning to everyone, whether they acknowledged him or not. The largest of the 3 men, a guy Sarah had mentally nicknamed Tank because of his massive shoulders and complete lack of neck, was holding a 20-pound dumbbell just inches from Miguel's face. Tank stood about 6 feet 4 inches tall and probably weighed close to 250 pounds, all of it contained in a frame that looked like it had been carved from granite and then inflated with a bicycle pump. "I told you to stay away from my equipment while I'm using it," Tank growled, his voice carrying the kind of barely controlled rage that Sarah had seen in unstable individuals throughout her military career. "You people need to learn some respect." Miguel clutched his cleaning supplies against his chest, his weathered hands shaking slightly. "I am sorry, Senator. I was just cleaning the mirrors. I didn't touch your weights, I promise." The second man, who Sarah had dubbed Hyena because of his high-pitched laugh and predatory grin, circled around behind Miguel like a wolf cutting off an escape route. "Maybe he doesn't understand English," Hyena suggested with a nasty smile. "Maybe we need to teach him a lesson he'll remember." The third member of their little pack, a wiry guy with arms covered in aggressive tattoos that Sarah recognized as white supremacist symbols, pulled out his phone and started recording. "This is going to be hilarious," he muttered. "Dude's about to learn what happens when you disrespect Americans in America." Sarah's rowing pace never changed, but her mind was already shifting into tactical mode. She noted the positions of all 3 men, calculated their likely combat experience based on their movements and posture, and identified the nearest exits and potential weapons. The gym was moderately crowded for a Tuesday evening, with about 20 other people scattered across various machines and workout areas. Most were wearing headphones and completely oblivious to the confrontation developing near the weights. The gym's layout worked against Miguel in this situation. The free weights section was tucked into a corner, partially hidden from the front desk by a row of cardio machines. The staff member on duty was a college kid named Tyler who spent most of his shift studying and rarely looked up from his textbooks. Even if someone wanted to help Miguel, the 3 men had positioned themselves in a way that blocked most lines of sight to their confrontation. Tank leaned closer to Miguel, and Sarah could see the older man's knees beginning to shake. "You know what I think?" Tank said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow carried clearly across the gym. "I think you came over here on purpose. I think you people are all thieves, and you were looking for something to steal." "No, senor, please," Miguel stammered, taking a step backward only to bump into Hyena, who had moved in behind him. "I was just doing my job. I have permission to clean everywhere in the gym." "Permission?" Tank laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "Permission from who?" "This is America, buddy. We don't give permission to people who sneak across our borders to take jobs from real Americans." Sarah's jaw tightened as she listened to the exchange. She had served alongside men and women of every nationality, race, and background imaginable during her military career. Some of the bravest, most honorable people she had ever known were immigrants who had chosen to serve their adopted country with distinction. The ignorance and hatred coming from these 3 men was exactly the kind of poison that she had spent years of her life fighting against. Hyena reached out and knocked Miguel's cleaning supplies from his hands, sending bottles of disinfectant and rolls of paper towels scattering across the floor. "Oops," he said with mock innocence. "Looks like someone made a mess. Better clean that up, janitor." The situation was escalating rapidly, and Sarah knew from experience that bullies like these three would continue pushing until they either got bored or someone pushed back. With Miguel trapped between them and no other gym members paying attention, things were about to get much worse. Sarah finished her rowing set and stood up, moving with a fluid, economical motion that had been drilled into her through years of military training. To a casual observer, she looked like any other gym member finishing her workout. She was wearing gray yoga pants and a simple black athletic shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. At 5 feet 7 inches tall and 140 pounds, she didn't look particularly intimidating. She looked like a soccer mom or a middle school teacher, which was exactly how she preferred it. As she walked toward the confrontation, Sarah's mind automatically cataloged everything about her three potential opponents. Tank was clearly the alpha of the group, used to getting his way through size and intimidation. His movements were slow and deliberate, suggesting someone who relied on brute force rather than speed or technique. Hyena was nervous energy wrapped in muscle, the type who would be dangerous in a group, but would likely run if isolated. The guy with the tattoos was recording everything, which meant he was more concerned with documenting the harassment than participating directly. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely as she approached the group, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by the three men, but not loud enough to draw attention from other gym members. "Is there a problem here?" Tank turned to look at her, his expression shifting from aggressive to dismissive in the space of a heartbeat. "Nothing that concerns you, lady. Keep walking." Sarah noticed that Miguel's eyes widened slightly when he saw her approaching. They had exchanged pleasantries dozens of times over the past few months, but she could see that he was confused about why a random gym member would involve herself in a situation. "Actually, it does concern me," Sarah replied calmly, positioning herself at an angle that would allow her to see all three men while keeping her back away from any walls or obstacles. "Miguel is just doing his job, and you're preventing him from completing his work." Hyena laughed, that high-pitched sound that had earned him his nickname. "Oh great, we got ourselves a white knight. Or should I say white princess?" He looked Sarah up and down with obvious contempt. "Listen, sweetheart, this doesn't involve you. Run along and do your little cardio workout before you get hurt." "I'm going to give you one chance to walk away," Sarah said, her voice remaining perfectly level despite the adrenaline beginning to flow through her system. "Apologize to Miguel, pick up the mess you made, and find somewhere else to work out." Tank stepped away from Miguel and moved towards Sarah, clearly intending to intimidate her into backing down. "Or what?" he growled. "What exactly do you think you're going to do about it, princess?" Sarah could see that Miguel was using the momentary distraction to start gathering up his scattered cleaning supplies, which was smart. The fewer innocent bystanders in the immediate area, the better this situation would be for everyone except the three bullies. "I'm going to ask you nicely one more time," Sarah said, her posture remaining relaxed and non-threatening. "Please leave this man alone and go find something better to do with your time." The guy with the tattoos stopped recording long enough to speak up. "Bro, this chick is seriously delusional. Should we show her what happens to people who don't mind their own business?" Tank grinned, revealing teeth that had seen too many fights and not enough dental care. "You know what? I think we should. I think Miss Hero here needs to learn some respect too." Sarah felt the familiar calm settle over her mind as the situation crossed from harassment into direct threat. It was the same feeling she had experienced countless times during her military career when training took over and everything else faded away except the mission at hand. In this case, the mission was simple: protect Miguel and neutralize the threat with minimal collateral damage. "Last chance," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving Tank's face. "Walk away now." "Or what?" Tank sneered, raising the 20-pound dumbbell he was still holding. "You going to call the manager? You going to tell your boyfriend? What exactly are you going to do, little girl?" Sarah's response was spoken in the same calm, conversational tone she might use to comment on the weather. "I'm going to hurt you. Badly." The three men burst into laughter at her words, clearly convinced they were dealing with someone who had watched too many action movies. Tank took another step toward her, now close enough that Sarah could smell his aggressive cologne and see the steroid-induced acne scars along his jawline. "You're going to hurt me?" Tank repeated, still chuckling. "Princess, I bench press more than you weigh. I got a black belt in karate, and I've been in more fights than you've had hot dinners. You sure you want to do this?" Sarah nodded once, a small, precise movement. "I'm sure." What happened next took place so quickly that most observers later said they couldn't quite follow the sequence of events. Sarah moved with the kind of speed and precision that could only come from years of training and real-world combat experience. There was no dramatic music, no slow-motion effects, no time for Tank to realize what was happening to him. Sarah's right hand shot forward in a movement that looked almost casual, striking Tank's wrist at exactly the right angle and with exactly the right amount of force to cause his fingers to spasmodically open. The 20-pound dumbbell fell from his suddenly nerveless grip, hitting the floor with a crash that finally drew the attention of other gym members. Before Tank could even register what had happened to his hand, Sarah's left elbow was driving upward into his solar plexus, striking with surgical precision at the cluster of nerves that would temporarily paralyze his diaphragm. Tank's eyes bulged as all the air rushed out his lungs, and he doubled over, gasping like a fish out of water. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds, and Tank was already out of the fight before Hyena, and the tattooed man realized that their alpha had just been neutralized by someone who looked like she should be teaching yoga classes. Sarah stepped back to give herself room to work, her eyes now fixed on Hyena, who was staring at his gasping friend with an expression of complete shock. "You have about 5 seconds to decide if you want to help him up and leave, or if you want to join him on the floor," she said conversationally. The gym had gone completely silent except for Tank's labored breathing and the hum of air conditioning. 20 pairs of eyes were now focused on the small drama playing out in the weight section, but no one seemed quite sure what they had just witnessed. Hyena looked at Sarah, then at Tank, then back at Sarah. His nervous energy had transformed into something much closer to panic as he realized that the small woman in yoga pants had just taken down someone who outweighed her by more than 100 pounds. "What the hell are you?" Hyena whispered. Sarah's smile was small and completely without humor. "Someone you don't want to mess with." Hyena's decision-making process was written clearly across his face as he weighed his options. Sarah could see him calculating whether he should run, fight, or try to help his fallen friend. The guy with the tattoos had stopped recording and was slowly backing toward the exit, apparently having decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Tank was still doubled over, making wheezing sounds as he tried to force air back into his lungs. The strike to his solar plexus had temporarily paralyzed his diaphragm, a technique Sarah had learned during her military training that was effective for neutralizing opponents without causing permanent damage. He would be fine in a few minutes, but right now he was about as threatening as a goldfish. "You know what?" Hyena said, his voice shaking slightly. "We're going to call the police. You just assaulted my friend. You can't just attack people because you don't like what they're saying." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right. We should definitely call the police. I'm sure they'll be very interested in the video your friend was taking of you 3 men intimidating and threatening an elderly immigrant. I'm sure they'll love to hear about how you knocked his cleaning supplies out of his hands and blocked his ability to leave." The color drained from Hyena's face as he realized that the situation wasn't going to play out the way he had imagined. "That's different," he stammered. "We weren't going to hurt the old guy. We were just messing around." "Messing around?" Sarah repeated, her voice carrying a note of dangerous calm. "Is that what you call cornering someone who can't defend himself and making threats? Is that what you call harassment based on someone's ethnicity?" By now, several other gym members had moved closer to see what was happening. Sarah noticed that Tyler, the college student working the front desk, had finally looked up from his textbooks and was walking over with a confused expression on his face. Miguel had finished gathering his cleaning supplies and was standing a safe distance away, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. Tank finally managed to straighten up, though he was still breathing heavily. His face was red with exertion and embarrassment, and Sarah could see the exact moment when his humiliation transformed into rage. She had seen that same expression on the faces of insurgents and enemy combatants throughout her military career. It was the look of someone who had been made to feel small and was about to do something stupid to compensate. "You think you're tough?" Tank gasped, spittle flying from his lips. "You think that little trick makes you some kind of badass? I'm going to show you what happens when you mess with the wrong people." Tank lunged forward with all the grace and subtlety of a charging bull. Sarah could see the attack coming from a mile away, telegraphed by his body language and the predictable rage-fueled aggression that always followed humiliation in men like him. She had exactly enough time to shake her head sadly before stepping aside and helping Tank achieve his apparent goal of meeting the floor. As Tank rushed past her, Sarah simply extended her leg and caught his ankle with her foot, using his own momentum against him in a move that would have been familiar to anyone who had studied basic physics. Tank's upper body continued moving forward while his foot stopped abruptly, and gravity took care of the rest. He crashed face first into the rubber mat with a sound like a bag of wet cement hitting concrete. The impact was hard enough to stun Tank, but not hard enough to cause serious injury. Sarah was always careful about using only the minimum force necessary to neutralize a threat, another habit left over from her military training. Excessive force created paperwork, investigations, and legal complications that she preferred to avoid. Hyena stared at his friend's prone form for a moment, then looked up at Sarah with an expression that mixed fear, confusion, and grudging respect. "How did you do that? What kind of martial arts training do you have?" "The kind that matters," Sarah replied simply. "Are you going to help him up? Or do I need to help you down?" Tyler finally reached the group, looking completely overwhelmed by the situation. "Oh, what's going on here? Is everyone okay?" Hyena pointed at Sarah with a shaking finger. "This crazy woman attacked us. She just started fighting for no reason. You need to call the police." Several of the other gym members who had witnessed the entire confrontation began speaking up at once. "No way, man," said a young woman who had been doing squats nearby. "Those guys were totally harassing the janitor. She was trying to help." "Yeah," added an older man who had been using the elliptical machine. "They were being complete jerks to that nice old guy. The woman tried to get them to stop, and the big dude threatened her." Tyler looked around helplessly, clearly unprepared for this kind of situation. "I think maybe I should call my manager," he said uncertainly. Tank began to stir, pushing himself up on his hands and knees with obvious effort. Sarah watched him carefully, ready to respond if he decided to make another aggressive move. But the fight seemed to have gone out of him, replaced by the kind of sullen anger that usually preceded strategic withdrawal. "This isn't over," Tank mumbled as he slowly got to his feet, blood trickling from his nose where it had connected with the floor. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying Tank with the same expression she might use to examine an interesting insect. "Actually, I have a pretty good idea who I'm messing with. The question is, do you have any idea who you just messed with?" There was something in her tone that made Tank hesitate. Perhaps it was the complete absence of fear in her voice, or the way she stood perfectly balanced and ready for whatever might come next. Or maybe it was the growing crowd of witnesses, all of whom seemed to be on her side. "Come on, guys," Hyena said, tugging at Tank's arm. "Let's just get out of here. This place sucks anyway." The tattooed man had already made it to the exit and was waving for his friends to follow him. "Yo, we need to bounce. Now." Tank wiped the blood from his nose and glared at Sarah with undisguised hatred. "This isn't over," he repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. "We'll see you around." "I certainly hope not," Sarah replied calmly. "But if you do see me around, I suggest you remember this conversation and choose your actions accordingly." The three men began moving toward the exit, Tank limping slightly and Hyena nervously looking back over his shoulder every few steps. As they reached the door, Tank turned around one more time. "What's your name?" he called out. "I want to know who I'm dealing with." Sarah considered the question for a moment, then decided that a little truth might be educational for everyone involved. "Sarah Martinez, former Navy SEAL, current person you don't want to mess with." The entire gym went completely silent. Even the background music seemed to fade away as the implications of her words sank in. Tank's face went through several interesting color changes as he processed what he had just heard. "You're lying," he said, but his voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah shrugged. Think whatever you want. But maybe next time you'll think twice before you decide to harass innocent people. Tank stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked out of the gym without another word. Hyena and the tattooed man followed close behind, and Sarah noticed that none of them looked back. The silence in the gym stretched for several more seconds before suddenly breaking as everyone began talking at once. Sarah found herself surrounded by curious and admiring gym members, all asking questions and wanting to know more about what they had just witnessed. Are you really a Navy SEAL? Asked a young man who looked like he might be active military himself. Were you really in combat? Wanted to know the woman who had been doing squats. Can you teach me how to do that thing with the wrist? Asked Tyler, apparently forgetting all about calling his manager. Sarah held up her hands for quiet, uncomfortable with the attention. I prefer not to talk about my military service, she said diplomatically. The important thing is that Miguel is safe, and those guys learned that there are consequences for bullying people. She looked around the circle of faces until she spotted Miguel, who was still standing near the wall with his cleaning supplies clutched against his chest. Miguel, are you okay? Did they hurt you? The older man shook his head vigorously. No, Senora, they did not hurt me. But you... He paused, searching for the right words in English. You were very brave. Very kind. Thank you. Sarah smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she had shown since the confrontation began. You don't need to thank me, Miguel. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, especially while they're just trying to do their job. Tyler finally seemed to remember that he was supposed to be managing the situation. Sarah, I probably need to fill out an incident report or something. And I should probably call the police to report what happened. Sarah nodded. That's probably a good idea. I'll be happy to give a statement. But I think you'll find that most of the people here will tell you the same story. 3 men were harassing Miguel. I asked them to stop, and they chose to make it physical. She's absolutely right, said the older man who had been on the elliptical. Those guys were completely out of line. Sarah was just standing up for someone who couldn't defend himself. Several other gym members voiced their agreement, and Sarah realized that she had more witnesses than she could have hoped for. The situation was clearly going to be resolved in her favor, assuming Tank and his friends were stupid enough to actually call the police. I don't think we'll be seeing those 3 again, she said to Tyler. But you might want to consider reviewing your membership policies. People like that create a hostile environment for other members and staff. Tyler nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely. I'll definitely talk to my manager about that. And, Sarah, thank you. That was really cool what you did. As the crowd began to disperse and people returned to their workouts, Sarah found herself alone with Miguel. The older man was looking at her with an expression of profound gratitude, mixed with something that might have been awe. Senora Sarah, he said quietly, I have been working here for many years, and many times people say things, do things that are not nice. But no one has ever. He struggled for a moment with the English, then continued. No one has ever stood up for me like that. Sarah felt a tightness in her chest as she listened to his words. She thought about all the men and women she had served alongside, people who had put their lives on the line to protect others, to defend the principles that made America worth fighting for. The idea that someone like Miguel, who worked hard and treated everyone with kindness, had to endure harassment and intimidation on a regular basis made her angry all over again. Miguel, she said gently, you are a good man who works hard and treats people with respect. You deserve better than what those guys were giving you. If anyone ever bothers you like that again, you come find me, okay? Miguel's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded vigorously. Si, senora. Thank you. Thank you so much. As Sarah watched Miguel return to his work, she reflected on what had just happened. She had spent 8 years in the military, had served in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, had faced down terrorists and enemy soldiers. But somehow, protecting a kind old man from 3 gym bullies felt just as important as any mission she had ever completed. She gathered her things and headed for the exit, planning to finish her workout at home. As she walked past the front desk, Tyler called out to her. Hey, Sarah, those guys, do you think they'll actually call the police? Sarah paused to consider the question. Probably not. Men like that prefer to bully people who can't fight back. They're not going to want to explain to the police why they were harassing an elderly janitor and threatening women. But what if they do? Sarah smiled. Then, they're going to have a very uncomfortable conversation with some police officers who won't be impressed by their story. And I'll be happy to explain exactly what happened and why. As she walked out into the evening air, Sarah felt a satisfaction that went deeper than any workout endorphins. She had done the right thing, protected someone who needed protection, and sent a clear message that bullying would not be tolerated. It was exactly the kind of mission she had trained for, just in a setting she had never expected. Behind her, the gym was returning to normal. Members were back to their routines. Tyler was studying for his next exam, and Miguel was quietly going about his work with a small smile on his face. And somewhere in Denver, 3 men were probably reevaluating their approach to intimidation and harassment. It had been a good evening's work. 3 days passed before Sarah saw any of the 3 men again. She had continued her regular workout routine at Iron Valley Fitness, partly because she genuinely enjoyed the gym and partly because she wanted to make sure Miguel felt safe returning to work. The older janitor had seemed much more relaxed during their brief conversations, even managing to joke in his limited English about how quickly those bad men had left. Sarah was finishing her Friday evening workout when Tyler approached her with a concerned expression. The college student had been much more attentive to the gym's atmosphere since the incident, clearly taking his responsibility for members' safety more seriously. "Hey, Sarah," he said quietly, glancing around nervously. "Those guys from Tuesday? The ones who were hassling Miguel? They're back." Sarah felt her muscles tense automatically, but she kept her expression calm. "All 3 of them. Just 2. The big guy, Tank I think you called him, and the nervous one. They've been here for about 20 minutes, mostly just sitting around and talking quietly. They keep looking toward the cleaning closet where Miguel keeps his stuff." Sarah finished her last set of shoulder exercises and set down the weights. "Where are they now?" "Near the front entrance. They're pretending to look at the membership information, but they've been standing there for 10 minutes without actually reading anything." Sarah nodded, her mind automatically shifting into tactical mode. The fact that Tank and Hyena had returned without their 3rd member was interesting. Either the tattooed man had decided he wanted no part of whatever they were planning, or he was somewhere else serving as a lookout or backup. The smart money was on the former, given how quickly he had fled during their first encounter. "Is Miguel working tonight?" Sarah asked. Tyler shook his head. "He doesn't usually come in on Fridays. His shift is Monday through Thursday, then Saturday and Sunday mornings." That was both good and bad news. Good because Miguel wasn't in immediate danger, bad because it suggested Tank and Hyena had done some reconnaissance to figure out the cleaning schedule. People who planned their harassment showed a level of premeditation that often led to more serious crimes. "Tyler," Sarah said seriously, "I want you to call the police. Don't make it obvious, but get someone here as soon as possible." "What do you think they're planning to do?" Sarah considered the question. Tank had been humiliated in front of a room full of people, and men like him rarely let that kind of embarrassment slide. The fact that he had come back suggested he was either planning some kind of revenge or trying to find a way to restore his damaged reputation. "I'm not sure," she said honestly, "but I don't think they came back just to work out." Tyler nodded and headed toward the front desk, pulling out his cell phone. Sarah remained where she was, using the mirror to observe Tank and Hyena without making it obvious that she was watching them. Both men were clearly agitated, speaking in hushed tones and making frequent gestures toward the interior of the gym. After a few minutes, Tank looked directly toward where Sarah was standing and said something to Hyena that made the smaller man laugh nervously. Then, they started walking in her direction. Sarah finished wiping down the equipment she had been using and turned to face them as they approached. Tank's nose was still slightly swollen from his encounter with the floor 3 days earlier, and he was moving with the stiff gait of someone whose pride was more injured than his body. Well, Tank said as he got within speaking distance. "Look who's here. It's our little Navy SEAL princess." Several other gym members looked up from their workouts at the sound of his voice. Sarah noticed that most of them recognized her and Tank from their previous encounter, and they were watching the developing situation with obvious concern. "Can I help you with something?" Sarah asked politely, maintaining a relaxed posture while positioning herself to respond to any sudden movements. Hyena stepped forward, trying to project an air of confidence that didn't quite reach his eyes. Yeah, actually you can. We did some research on you, Sarah Martinez. Turns out there's no record of any Sarah Martinez ever serving as a Navy SEAL. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Tank grinned with satisfaction, clearly believing he had gained some kind of advantage. That's right. We checked with a guy who knows military records. No woman named Sarah Martinez has ever been through SEAL training. You're a fraud. Interesting, Sarah replied calmly. And you decided to come back here to share this information with me because you embarrassed us based on a lie, Tank said, his voice rising slightly. You made us look like fools in front of all these people by pretending to be some kind of military hero. You're nothing but a liar who probably learned a couple of moves watching YouTube videos. Sarah noticed that Tyler was talking quietly into his phone behind the front desk, hopefully with the police dispatcher. She also saw that Miguel had apparently arrived for some kind of extra shift because he was emerging from the employee break room with his cleaning cart. So what exactly are you planning to do about this supposed lie? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about their logic. Hyena pulled out his phone and started recording. We're going to expose you for the fraud you are. We're going to show everyone here that you're not some tough military lady. You're just another wannabe who got lucky once. Tank cracked his knuckles dramatically. And then we're going to finish what we started the other day. Nobody makes a fool out of me and gets away with it. Sarah sighed deeply. You know, you're not entirely wrong about the research part. Both men looked surprised by her admission. Tank's grin widened, and Hyena leaned in closer with his phone to catch every word. There probably isn't a military record for Sarah Martinez serving as a Navy SEAL, she continued conversationally. Of course, there also isn't a military record for Sarah Martinez doing anything else military-related. The two men exchanged confused glances. What's that supposed to mean? Tank demanded. Sarah's smile was small and completely without humor. It means Sarah Martinez is the name I use for civilian life. My military service was under a different name entirely. The confidence began to drain from Tank's expression as he processed the implications of what she was saying. You're lying. Am I? Tell me something, Tank. When you had your friend research military records, did you consider the fact that many special operations personnel serve under classified identities? Did you think about the possibility that someone who spent 8 years in one of the most secretive units in the military might not have their real name plastered all over public records? Hyena's phone was shaking in his hand as the reality of their situation began to sink in. But there should still be some record. Should there? Sarah asked pleasantly. Have you ever heard of operational security? Do you think the military publishes the real names and service records of people who conducted classified missions in hostile territory? Tank's face was going through another series of interesting color changes as he realized they might have made an enormous mistake. You could still be lying. I could be, Sarah agreed. But are you really willing to bet your health on it? At that moment, Miguel's cleaning cart hit a small bump in the floor, causing several bottles to rattle. The sound drew everyone's attention to the elderly janitor, who was slowly making his way across the gym floor, apparently unaware of the confrontation taking place near the weights. Tank's expression suddenly shifted from uncertainty to malicious satisfaction. You know what? It doesn't matter whether you're really military or not. We came here to teach someone a lesson, and if it's not going to be you, it might as well be your little friend over there. Sarah felt ice water flow through her veins as Tank started moving toward Miguel. She had seen this kind of displacement aggression before, usually in unstable individuals who redirected their anger toward easier targets when confronted with someone they couldn't intimidate. Stop, Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a note of absolute command that had been honed by years of leading men and women in life-or-death situations. Tank paused and looked back at her. Or what? You going to tell us another story about your pretend military service? No, Sarah replied, her tone remaining conversational. I'm going to put you in the hospital. The simple directness of her statement seemed to hit Tank like a physical blow. There was no posturing, no dramatic threats, just a calm statement of fact delivered by someone who clearly had the skills to back it up. Hyena grabbed Tank's arm. Dude, maybe we should just leave? The police are probably coming, and this is getting way out of hand." Tank shook him off, but Sarah could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The situation was escalating beyond his comfort zone, but his pride was forcing him to continue down a path that was going to end very badly for him. "You think you can threaten me?" Tank snarled, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "You think some fancy words are going to scare me off?" Sarah began walking toward him, and Tank instinctively took a step backward. "I'm not trying to scare you," she said calmly. "I'm trying to educate you. But if you take one more step toward Miguel, your education is going to become much more hands-on." Tank looked around the gym, suddenly seeming to notice that every single person was watching him. Unlike their first encounter, this confrontation was taking place in full view of dozens of witnesses, all of whom had seen him threaten both Sarah and Miguel. "This is crazy," Hyena whispered urgently. "Let's just get out of here before the cops show up." For a moment, it looked like Tank might listen to reason. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and he took another step away from Miguel's direction. But then he seemed to remember his injured pride, and Sarah could see the exact moment when he decided to double down on stupidity. "You know what?" Tank said loudly, apparently addressing the entire gym. "I don't care if this woman is military or not. I don't care if the police are coming. I'm tired of people thinking they can disrespect me." He started moving toward Miguel again, faster this time, with Hyena trailing reluctantly behind. Sarah knew she had about 3 seconds to end the situation before an innocent man got hurt. What happened next was a textbook example of controlled violence applied with surgical precision. Sarah moved with the kind of speed that came from muscle memory trained through thousands of hours of practice. Tank was focused on Miguel and didn't see her coming until it was far too late to respond. Sarah's first strike was a nerve cluster attack to Tank's shoulder, delivered with her knuckles at exactly the right angle to temporarily paralyze his entire right arm. Tank's shocked expression as his arm went completely limp was almost comical, but Sarah wasn't finished with her lesson. Her second strike was an open palm thrust to Tank's sternum, delivered with just enough force to stop his forward momentum and drive all the air from his lungs. Tank doubled over, gasping and clutching at his chest with his one functioning hand. The entire sequence had taken less than 2 seconds, and Tank was effectively neutralized before Hyena even realized the fight had started. The smaller man looked at his friend, then at Sarah, then back at his friend. "Ow!" Hyena stammered. "How did you do that so fast?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she waited until Tank had recovered enough breath to look up at her, then spoke in the same calm, conversational tone she had been using throughout the encounter. "That was me being gentle," she said quietly, so only Tank and Hyena could hear. "The next time I see you anywhere near Miguel or any other employee of this gym, I won't be nearly so restrained. Are we clear?" Tank nodded weakly, still unable to speak properly. His right arm was beginning to regain feeling, but Sarah could see that he was finally starting to understand that he was completely outclassed. In the distance, Sarah could hear the sound of sirens approaching. Tyler had apparently managed to get through to the police, and they would be arriving soon to sort out the situation. "I suggest you two leave now," Sarah said, stepping back to give them room to retreat. "Unless you'd prefer to explain to the police why you came back here to threaten people." Hyena was already pulling Tank toward the exit, clearly desperate to avoid any contact with law enforcement. Tank was moving slowly, but steadily, his pride finally overcome by self-preservation instincts. As they reached the door, Tank turned back one more time. "This isn't over," he said weakly. Sarah's smile was as cold as a winter morning. "Yes, it is." The police arrived 15 minutes after Tank, and Hyena had fled the gym. Officer Rebecca Chun was a 15-year veteran of the Denver Police Department who specialized in assault cases, and she approached the situation with the thorough professionalism that had earned her respect throughout the department. Sarah provided a detailed statement of both incidents, carefully sticking to the facts while emphasizing that she had used only the minimum force necessary to protect herself and others. Officer Chun listened carefully, taking notes and asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she understood the nuances of self-defense law. "You mentioned that you have military experience," Officer Chun said as she reviewed her notes. "Can you elaborate on that?" Sarah had been expecting this question. I served 8 years in Naval Special Operations. I'm trained in various defensive techniques, which is why I was able to neutralize the threats so quickly. Officer Chen nodded. Do you have documentation of your military service? Sarah pulled out her wallet and handed over a card. My VA identification. I prefer not to discuss the specifics of my service, but I can provide character references if necessary. Officer Chen examined the ID carefully, then handed it back. That won't be necessary. Your statement is consistent with the witness accounts, and it's clear that you were acting in defense of yourself and others. Tyler had provided security camera footage from both incidents, which clearly showed Tank and Hyena as the aggressors. Several gym members had also volunteered to give statements supporting Sarah's version of events. What happens now? Sarah asked. We'll file a report and attempt to identify the 2 men who threatened you. Officer Chen replied. If they're smart, they'll stay away from this establishment. If they're not smart, and they continue to harass you or the other employees here, we'll be ready for them. After the police finished their investigation and left, Sarah found herself once again surrounded by curious gym members. The crowd was larger this time, drawn by the presence of law enforcement and the growing legend of the Navy SEAL lady who had single-handedly faced down multiple attackers. That was incredible, said a young woman who had witnessed both confrontations. You moved so fast I could barely follow what happened. Will you teach me some of those moves? Asked a middle-aged man who had been struggling with his own confidence issues. Sarah held up her hands for quiet, still uncomfortable with the attention. I appreciate everyone's support, but I really prefer not to discuss my training or techniques. The important thing is that everyone here feels safe and respected. She looked around the group until she spotted Miguel, who was standing near the edge of the crowd with an expression of profound gratitude. Miguel, I hope you know that you have a lot of friends here who care about your well-being. The older man's eyes filled with tears as he nodded. See, Senora, I know this now. Before, I thought maybe people do not see me, do not care about me. But now I know I have friends. Several gym members spoke up at once, expressing their support for Miguel and their appreciation for his hard work. It was clear that the incidents with Tank and his friends had awakened the gym community to something they had previously taken for granted. Over the following weeks, Iron Valley Fitness transformed into something more than just a place to exercise. Members began greeting Miguel warmly, asking about his family, and expressing genuine interest in his well-being. Tyler instituted new policies to prevent harassment and discrimination, and the gym's management increased security during evening hours. Sarah settled back in her routine, but she noticed that her presence seemed to have a calming effect on the entire facility. Other members felt more confident to speak up when they witnessed inappropriate behavior, and the overall atmosphere became more welcoming and inclusive. 3 weeks after the second incident, Sarah was approached by a young woman named Maria Gonzalez. Maria was a college student who had recently joined the gym, and she had been struggling with intimidation from a group of fraternity boys who seemed to think harassing women was an acceptable form of entertainment. Sarah, Maria said nervously, I was wondering if I could ask you for some advice. Sarah finished her set and gave Maria her full attention. Of course. What's going on? Maria explained the situation with the fraternity boys, describing how they made inappropriate comments, followed her around the gym, and generally made her feel unsafe during her workouts. I thought about complaining to management, but these guys are all members too, and I don't want to cause trouble. Sarah listened carefully, recognizing the familiar pattern of intimidation tactics. Maria, you have every right to feel safe and comfortable here. No one should have to tolerate harassment just because they want to exercise. But what can I do? I'm not like you. I don't have military training or special fighting skills. Sarah smiled gently. You don't need military training to stand up for yourself. What you need is confidence, support, and the knowledge that you're not alone. Over the next few days, Sarah worked with Maria to develop strategies for dealing with the harassment. She taught her assertiveness techniques, helped her document incidents, and most importantly, made sure she understood that seeking help was not a sign of weakness. When the fraternity boys made their next attempt to harass Maria, they found themselves facing not just one determined young woman, but a network of gym members who had been watching and waiting for them to cross the line. Sarah wasn't even present when it happened, but her influence was felt throughout the confrontation. Tyler immediately ejected the fraternity boys from the gym and banned them from the premises. Several other members backed up Maria's account of the harassment, and the police were called to file a formal complaint. The message was clear. Iron Valley Fitness had become a place where bullying and intimidation would not be tolerated. Word of the gym's zero-tolerance policy began to spread throughout the community. New members joined specifically because they had heard it was a safe, respectful environment. Existing members brought friends and family, knowing they would be welcomed and protected. Miguel's English had improved dramatically during this time, partly because so many people were now taking the time to talk with him. He had started bringing photographs of his family to share with interested gym members, and his confidence had grown to the point where he was comfortable joining conversations and even making jokes. One evening, as Sarah was finishing her workout, Miguel approached her with a carefully wrapped package. "Senora Sarah," he said formally, "my wife, she wanted to send you something special." Inside the package was a beautiful hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool, along with a letter written in careful English. The letter thanked Sarah for her kindness and courage, and explained that Miguel's wife had spent weeks working on the scarf as a way to express her family's gratitude. "She says blue is the color of protection," Miguel explained. "She says you are like an angel of protection for people who need help." Sarah felt a lump in her throat as she held the scarf. In her military career, she had received medals, commendations, and official recognition for her service. But somehow, this simple gift from the family of an elderly janitor meant more to her than all the formal honors combined. "Please tell your wife that this is the most beautiful gift I've ever received," Sarah said quietly. "And tell her that helping you wasn't just the right thing to do, it was an honor." As the months passed, Sarah began to understand that her intervention in Miguel's harassment had created something larger than just a resolution to a single conflict. She had demonstrated that ordinary people could make a difference when they chose to act with courage and compassion. The gym had become a model for how communities could police themselves, how bystanders could become allies, and how standing up to bullies created safer spaces for everyone. Other businesses in the area began implementing similar policies, and the local police department started using Iron Valley Fitness as an example of effective community-based conflict resolution. Sarah still preferred to keep her military background private, but she had learned that sometimes sharing your strength with others multiplied it rather than diminishing it. She had trained dozens of women in basic self-defense techniques, helped Tyler develop better security protocols, and served as an unofficial mentor to gym members who were dealing with various forms of intimidation or harassment. The most important lesson, however, was one that Miguel had taught her without realizing it. True strength wasn't about the ability to defeat opponents in combat. True strength was about creating environments where decent people could thrive without fear, where hard work was respected regardless of background, and where standing up for others was seen as a natural extension of being human. Tank and Hyena never returned to Iron Valley Fitness. According to Officer Chun, they had been identified through the security footage and had been issued formal warnings about harassment and trespassing. Word through the local gym network was that they had moved on to a different facility across town, where their behavior had quickly gotten them banned as well. Sarah often wondered if they had learned anything from their encounters with her, or if they had simply moved on to harass other people in other places. She hoped for the former, but suspected the latter. Change rarely came easily to people who had built their identity around intimidating others. But the important thing was that Miguel was safe, Maria had found her voice, and dozens of other gym members had learned that they didn't have to tolerate disrespectful behavior from anyone. The ripple effects of Sarah's simple decision to stand up for an elderly janitor continued to spread throughout the community, creating positive change in ways she was still discovering. As Sarah drove home that evening, wearing her new blue scarf despite the warm weather, she reflected on how much her life had changed since leaving the military. She had thought her days of protecting others were behind her, but She had learned that there were battles being fought every day in ordinary places by ordinary people who just needed someone to show them that they weren't alone. It was exactly the kind of mission she had always been proud to serve. 6 months after the initial confrontation with Tank and his friends, Sarah received a phone call that would change her perspective on the long-term impact of standing up to bullies. The caller was Detective James Morrison from the Denver Police Department's Special Victims Unit, and he had an unusual request. Ms. Martinez, Detective Morrison said, "We have a situation that we think might benefit from your expertise. Are you familiar with the Riverside Community Center?" Sarah knew the center well. It was located in a lower-income neighborhood about 10 miles from Iron Valley Fitness, serving primarily elderly residents and immigrant families. "Yes, I've done some volunteer work there." "What's the situation?" "We've been getting reports of harassment and intimidation targeting the center's users, particularly elderly immigrants and women attending evening classes. The pattern is similar to what happened at your gym, but it's more organized and more persistent." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her stomach. "How organized are we talking about?" Detective Morrison's voice was grim. "We think it's the same group that was harassing people at your gym, but they've recruited more members and they've escalated their tactics. They're not just targeting individuals anymore. They're trying to drive certain groups out of the community center entirely." Sarah sat down heavily in her kitchen chair, processing the implications of what she was hearing. Tank and Hyena hadn't learned their lesson after all. Instead, they had apparently decided to expand their operations and target more vulnerable victims. "What do you need from me?" Sarah asked. "We'd like you to visit the community center, assess the situation, and help us develop a strategy for protecting the people who use it. Your background in special operations, combined with your experience dealing with these specific individuals, makes you uniquely qualified to help." Sarah agreed to meet Detective Morrison at the community center the following evening. As she drove through the neighborhood, she was struck by how different it felt from the area around Iron Valley Fitness. The streets were narrower, the lighting was dimmer, and there was an overall sense of economic struggle that made the residents seem more vulnerable to predatory behavior. The Riverside Community Center was a converted school building that offered ESL classes, job training programs, senior citizen services, and various community activities. When Sarah arrived, she could see why it would be attractive to bullies looking for easy targets. Detective Morrison met her in the parking lot, along with Maria Santos, the center's director. Maria was Miguel's daughter, which explained how Detective Morrison had made the connection to Sarah. "My father has told me so much about you," Maria said as she shook Sarah's hand. "He says you're the bravest person he has ever met." Sarah felt embarrassed by the praise. "Your father is a good man who deserves to be treated with respect. I just did what anyone should do." Maria's expression grew serious. "That's exactly why we need your help now. The people who have been harassing our center users are targeting individuals who remind them of my father. Elderly immigrants, people with limited English, anyone they perceive as vulnerable." Detective Morrison led them inside the building, where Sarah could see about 30 people attending various evening programs. There were elderly women in a computer literacy class, a group of men studying for their citizenship test, and teenagers getting help with homework. The harassment usually happens in the parking lot or just outside the building, Detective Morrison explained. Groups of young men position themselves near the exits and make threatening comments, take photos without permission, and sometimes follow people to their cars. "Have there been any physical confrontations?" Sarah asked. "Not yet, but it's escalating. Last week they started bringing signs with anti-immigrant messages, and they've been live streaming their harassment on social media." Sarah studied the layout of the building and the surrounding area, automatically noting sightlines, escape routes, and potential defensive positions. "How many people are we talking about?" "The core group seems to be about 6 individuals, but they sometimes have as many as 15 people show up for their demonstrations," Maria said. "We've tried working with the police, but they haven't broken any laws yet. They stay on public property and claim they're exercising their First Amendment rights." Sarah nodded, understanding the legal complexities. "And you think this is the same group from a gym?" Detective Morrison pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph taken during one of the community center demonstrations. Sarah immediately recognized Tank and Hyena standing near a pickup truck, holding a sign that read, "America for Americans." "There they are," Sarah said quietly. "And they've definitely upgraded their operation. We think your reputation from a gym incident has actually made them more determined," Detective Morrison continued. "According to our intelligence, they see the community center as a place where they can harass people without interference from anyone with your skills." Sarah felt a surge of anger at the thought that her actions had inadvertently led to more vulnerable people being targeted. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "We want you to help us develop a community-based response," Maria said. "Not vigilante justice, but organized legal resistance that makes it clear these people aren't welcome here." Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah worked with Detective Morrison, Maria, and community leaders to develop a comprehensive strategy for dealing with the harassment. The plan involved multiple components: legal documentation of harassment, community education about bystander intervention, and the creation of a volunteer safety escort program. Sarah's role was to train community volunteers in de-escalation techniques and basic self-defense, while also serving as a visible deterrent to the harassment group. Her presence alone, they hoped, might be enough to discourage Tank and his expanded crew from continuing their activities. The first test of their strategy came on a Wednesday evening when the harassment group showed up with their largest crowd yet. Sarah was positioned inside the community center, monitoring the situation through windows while staying out of direct sight. Tank and Hyena were there, along with about 12 other young men carrying signs and portable speakers. They had positioned themselves just outside the property line, technically on public sidewalk, where they began shouting slogans and playing loud music designed to intimidate people entering and leaving the building. The difference this time was that the community center was ready for them. Volunteers with cameras began documenting everything. Community members started arriving in groups rather than individually, and Detective Morrison was parked nearby in an unmarked car. Sarah watched as Elena Rodriguez, a 70-year-old woman attending the computer class, approached the building with obvious nervousness. The harassment group immediately focused their attention on her, shouting comments about her appearance and demanding to see her papers. This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. She stepped out of the community center and walked calmly toward Elena, positioning herself between the elderly woman and the hostile crowd. Tank spotted her immediately, and Sarah could see recognition and uncertainty flash across his face. He said something to the men around him, and several of them looked in her direction with obvious concern. "Good evening, Elena," Sarah said loudly enough for the harassment group to hear. "How are you doing tonight?" Elena looked confused for a moment, then understood that Sarah was providing protection. "I am fine, thank you," she replied in accented English. "Thank you for walking with me." Sarah escorted Elena to the building entrance, then turned to face Tank and his crew. "Gentlemen," she called out conversationally, "beautiful evening for a walk, isn't it?" Tank's response was to gesture to his followers and start moving closer to the property line. Well, if it isn't our favorite fake soldier. Come to protect more of your immigrant friends." Sarah's smile was polite and completely without warmth. "Actually, I came to see how you've been doing since our last conversation. You look well, both arms working properly again." Several of Tank's followers looked confused by this exchange, clearly unaware of their leader's previous encounters with Sarah. Tank's face reddened as he realized she was referring to their confrontation at the gym. "You got lucky last time," Tank called out, but his voice lacked conviction. "This time, there are more of us." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That's true. Of course, there are also more witnesses, more cameras, and several police officers in the area. Plus, I've had 6 months to think about our previous conversations, and I've come up with some new educational techniques." The uncertainty in Tank's expression was growing more obvious by the moment. Sarah could see him trying to figure out whether she was bluffing or whether he was about to walk into another humiliating confrontation. "Besides," Sarah continued in the same conversational tone, "I've brought some friends of my own." As if on cue, 3 other figures emerged from the community center. They were all veterans from Sarah's military network, men and women who had volunteered to help protect the community center after hearing about the harassment situation. Tank's eyes widened as he took in the new arrivals. Unlike Sarah, who dressed to blend in, these volunteers were clearly former military. Their posture, their bearing, and their obvious confidence marked them as people with serious training and experience. "So," Sarah said pleasantly, "did you want to continue your demonstration, or would you prefer to have a quiet conversation about finding more constructive ways to spend your evenings?" The standoff lasted for nearly a full minute as Tank tried to decide whether his pride was worth the likely consequences of escalating the situation. His followers were looking increasingly nervous as they realized they might be facing opposition that was significantly more capable than anything they had encountered before. Finally, Tank made the smart decision. "Come on, guys," he said to his crew, trying to salvage some dignity. "This place isn't worth our time anyway." As the harassment group began packing up their signs and speakers, Sarah called out one final message. "Tank, if you decide you want to find more positive ways to contribute to your community, the community center offers volunteer opportunities. Just something to think about." Tank's only response was to give her a one-finger salute before climbing into his pickup truck. Detective Morrison approached Sarah as the harassment group drove away. "Think that'll be the end of it?" Sarah watched the taillights disappear into the distance. "For this location, probably. But people like Tank don't usually change their fundamental behavior. They'll likely move on to harass other vulnerable groups in other places. So what do we do about that?" Sarah turned to look at the community center, where dozens of people were now entering for their evening classes without fear or intimidation. "We do exactly what we did here. We organize, we train, we support each other, and we make it clear that bullying and harassment aren't acceptable in our community." Over the following months, the community center's volunteer safety program became a model for other organizations throughout Denver. Sarah continued training volunteers in de-escalation and basic self-defense, while also working with local law enforcement to develop better protocols for handling harassment situations. Tank and his group were eventually arrested for vandalism and harassment at a different location across town, where they had escalated to property damage when they couldn't find easy victims to intimidate. Several members of the group pled guilty to various charges and were sentenced to community service, which Sarah privately thought was probably the best possible outcome for everyone involved. The most satisfying result, however, came 6 months later when Sarah received a letter from Elena Rodriguez, the elderly woman she had escorted into the community center that evening. Elena had completed her computer literacy course and had started volunteering to help other students. She had also convinced her grandson to join the community center's volunteer safety program. "You showed me that ordinary people can be heroes," Elena wrote in carefully practiced English. "Now I try to be a hero for other people too." Sarah kept that letter on her refrigerator, next to a photograph from Miguel's citizenship ceremony and a thank you card from Maria Gonzalez, who had finished college and started working as a counselor for victims of harassment and domestic violence. The simple decision to stand up for an elderly janitor had created ripples that continued to spread throughout her community, inspiring others to act with courage and compassion when they witnessed injustice. Sarah had learned that heroism wasn't about individual acts of physical courage, but about creating networks of support that made entire communities stronger and safer. She still worked out at Iron Valley Fitness, still maintained her military-level fitness, and still kept her special operations skills sharp through regular training. But her real mission had evolved into something larger and more meaningful than anything she had done in uniform. She was helping to build a community where bullies couldn't thrive, where vulnerable people were protected, and where ordinary citizens understood they had the power to make a difference. It was exactly the kind of mission worth dedicating a lifetime to serve.